Welcome to Playback with another episode of history. When you think of a massive drug cartel, what comes to mind? You probably picture stacks of cash, speedboats, guys named Pablo, right? Well, today we're digging into the biggest drug operation in history, and trust me, the kingpin is the absolute last person you'd ever expect. Yeah, forget the jungles of South America. The real powerhouse here was the British Empire. And forget speedboats, their distribution network was the Royal Navy. And it was all happening, in a way, under the watchful eye of Queen Victoria herself. This wasn't some shady criminal enterprise hiding out. This was official state-sponsored policy. And here's where the story gets really wild. When their biggest customer, China, tried to say no more, Britain didn't just walk away. Oh no. They declared war to force an entire nation to keep buying their drugs. It's an absolutely incredible story about how a simple cup of tea fueled an imperial heroin trade. So how on earth did we get here? Well, this entire conflict, it all starts with an addiction. But probably not the one you're thinking of. It was Britain's addiction, a massive, nation-defining obsession with tea. To say the British liked tea is a serious understatement. They were completely obsessed. By the early 1800s, they were importing millions upon millions of pounds of the stuff every single year. And there was only one place in the entire world they could get it: China. Now, this created a huge economic problem. The Qing dynasty in China was more than happy to sell their tea, but they only wanted one thing for it: silver. So Britain was buying so much tea that its national treasury was just hemorrhaging silver. It was creating this catastrophic trade deficit. They were literally going broke just to get their tea fix. The British tried everything to balance the books. They offered to trade their own goods, wool, fancy clocks, scientific instruments, but China just wasn't interested. As the Qianlong Emperor so famously put it, they already had everything they needed. So that left Britain with a giant problem that was going to need a radical, and as it turns out, a morally catastrophic solution. So Britain had to find something, anything, that China would actually buy. And the group that figured this out wasn't really the government, not at first anyway. It was a corporation that came up with one of the most profitable and one of the most destructive business models in all of history. Let's talk about the East India Company. It is so hard to overstate just how powerful these guys were. They weren't just some trading company. No, they had their own private army. They governed huge territories like India, and they basically acted as an arm of the British state. They were a corporate monster unlike anything the world had ever seen before. And their brilliant solution to that silver crisis? It came from the poppy fields of British-controlled India. They started producing massive amounts of a sticky black substance. Now, it had been used as medicine, sure, but the company started refining it into a potent, smokable, and incredibly addictive form. Let's just call it what it was: 19th century heroin, opium. The business model they came up with was, well, brilliantly simple and devious. A 3-step triangle trade. Step 1, grow the opium in India. Step 2, smuggle it into China, where, by the way, it was totally illegal, and sell it to local dealers for silver. And Step 3, use that exact same silver to buy Chinese tea. The money never even had to leave their little system. For Britain, it was a perfect closed loop. They got their beloved tea, and they got all their silver back. Problem solved. But for China, the results were absolutely devastating. We're talking millions of people addicted to a horrible drug, and a society and an economy that were starting to just crumble from the inside. Okay, so by the late 1830s, the situation in China had spiraled into a full-blown crisis. The emperor just couldn't ignore the social rot caused by all this opium anymore. He decided he had to do something and do it decisively to stamp out this trade once and for all. And the man he sent to lead this crackdown was his most trusted official, Commissioner Lin Zexu. Seriously, think of him as the Elliot Ness of his day, a man completely dedicated to his mission and totally immune to the bribes that had let this trade fester for so long. Commissioner Lin shows up in Canton, the heart of the opium trade, and gets to work immediately. He arrests thousands of dealers, seizes all their supplies, and then he blockades the foreign traders in their warehouses, demanding they hand over every last bit of opium. Then, in this huge public spectacle, he destroys 2.6 million pounds of it, mixing it with lime and washing it all out to sea. So how did Britain react to having its massive, illegal drug supply destroyed? With an apology? Maybe a little shame? Nope, not even close. In what has to be one of the most staggering displays of imperial arrogance ever, They demanded that the Chinese government pay them back for the full value of the drugs they destroyed. Back in London, the debate in Parliament was, well, it was something else. They very carefully framed it. They didn't talk about selling narcotics. Oh no. Instead, they argued that China had destroyed British property, that it was an insult to the crown, and most importantly, that China had violated the sacred principle of free trade. It was truly a masterclass in political spin. So they sent the Navy, and this was never, ever going to be a fair fight. China's Navy was made of traditional wooden junk ships. They relied on the wind. The British, on the other hand, brought their brand new secret weapon, the Nemesis. It was an iron-hulled steamship that could sail up rivers against the current. It was like bringing a tank to a sword fight. It was a total mismatch. The result was a swift, brutal, and frankly inevitable defeat for China. The British military just dismantled China's coastal defenses, sailed right up the Yangtze River, and threatened the capital itself. The war was over, but its consequences, man, they would echo for more than 100 years. In 1842, China was forced to sign the first of what would become known as the unequal treaties. And the terms were just crushing. They had to pay for Britain's war expenses, they had to pay for the opium they destroyed, they were forced to open up 5 of their major ports to foreign traders, and they had to hand over a small rocky island called Hong Kong to the British Empire. And here's the most cynical, most unbelievable part of this whole thing. The Treaty of Nanking, the document that ended a war that was started over drugs, doesn't mention the word opium. Not once. So the trade wasn't made legal, but it wasn't stopped either. In fact, with all these new ports open, it just exploded to even bigger levels. For China, this war was the beginning of a period that they still call the Century of Humiliation. It kicked off decades of foreign intervention and subjugation, and it fundamentally changed the country's destiny and its relationship with the rest of the world, right up to this very day. You know, this whole conflict forces us to ask a really tough question about history. We tend to think of free trade as this great modernizing force, but this story shows how that same idea can be twisted into a weapon for exploitation on a massive scale. So it really begs the question, right? When is free trade not actually free? Let us know what you think down in the comments. At the end of the day, the story of the Opium Wars is a pretty powerful lesson. The British Empire got its tea, the merchants got their silver, but it all came at an unimaginable human cost. It's just a stark reminder that when profit becomes the one and only moral compass, absolutely anything can be turned into a product. If you found this dive into the darker side of history as fascinating as we did, make sure you subscribe to Playback. We have so many more stories like this to tell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.